Hello, and welcome back to my channel, Talented Reads. We are back with another wrap-up video, which is my February wrap-up for the horror challenge. So it's been a while since I've posted a horror wrap-up, and I think I have some new subscribers, like 2, but I thought I would just take a minute and kind of reintroduce the horror challenge. I first came across this graphic from the Popcorn Horror blog. I think the blog Horror on Screen originally made the post in which they talked about the different horror genres and kind of just like laid it all out there. And it has been since updated, in some subcategories have been added at the bottom by Simple Film Reviews and Popcorn Horror, which is how I came across it. I love this graphic. I think this is a fantastic resource for horror and anybody who's maybe wanting to get into the horror genre but don't really know where to start. I think a lot of people assume horror with monstery, your classic like possession stuff. But as you can see, I mean, there's a lot of subgenres. I think this really does a good job at showing kind of how complex it is. And for anybody looking to go into horror, I think there's a place to start for everybody. Now, you can see from this graphic that this is really focused more on movies, but what I wanted to do is take this and kind of translate it into books. So I've taken this and I'm kind of focusing on one subgenre a month, and I'm just slowly but surely making my way through all of the subgenres. I actually started on the far right side with paranormal, since that's really what I'm most familiar with. I would say I tend to gravitate towards that kind of horror. So I'm kind of working more from like most familiar to less familiar. Yeah. So yeah, I'll work across and then down the bottom part. And so the way that I'm choosing to run this challenge for myself is, I know that I'm translating this into books and this is made more for movies. And as someone who loves horror movies just as much as I love horror books, I wanted to do a mix of books and movies. So I'll read, I've picked like a group of books to read, anywhere from 4 to 5 books. I've tried to stick with 5 books, but sometimes I end up just getting to 4. And then a group of movies to watch, which has been about 4 movies. And then I will layer on some recommendations that I have, 2 books that I've read previously that I would like to recommend in that subgenre, as well as some movies that I've previously watched that I think would fit well into that category. So from our most current graphic, where I am currently at, is in the monster section. I completed the entire paranormal section and the first half of the monster section. I have a playlist with the videos that I've done for the horror challenge for some of these other subcategories, and I will tell you, like, after Christmas, I've kind of been falling off the wagon and posting videos, so some of these may not be there, but there's quite a bit of them, so I'll link that entire playlist in the description box if you want to check those videos out. February specifically was all about animals and nature, so let's get into it. I read a total of 4 horror books, First was Vespers by Jeff Rovin. This is about scientist Nancy, I think Nancy Joyce is her name, and Detective Gentry, who investigate a series of like bizarre bat attacks around New York City. I read this, I think I was in high school when I first read this, and I remember really liking it. And so when I knew that I was going to be reading Animals in Nature, I really wanted to pick it up again and read it. This is an older book, and I really enjoyed this. There was a lot of bat knowledge in this, which I really enjoy learning about. I mean, I'm not a bat specialist, so I can't really speak to like how accurate it was, but it all sounded good to me. And the bat attacks certainly gave me the chills. I think there were a couple of slow parts in this as the scientists are trying to gather data, but the overall feeling was just gloom and doom, which, I think when I think about animal attacks, I think that is a pretty fair feeling to have in your book. So yeah, I would recommend this. Next is Jaws by Peter Benchley. If you haven't heard about it at this point, this is basically about a shark that terrorizes Amity, this little town of Amity, during the summer. And there's a local police chief, Brody, who is kind of taking it upon himself to stop this great white shark so that Amity can get back to its summer events. Okay, so I have seen this movie, but this is actually the first time reading the book. And I have to admit, I like the movie better. Now, for me, one thing both the book and movie were lacking was more shark scenes. I thought this obviously has a certain nostalgia with it, and so I think that's really the best part about the book. But for a book that's supposedly about a shark attack, like, I just expected more intense scenes around that. Yeah. But I do have to give credit to the author who, I read a couple articles, and since the publication of this book, he is kind of like openly admitted to not really understanding sharks like at the time of writing this book. And I know since then he's done a lot of like ocean conservation and all of that, which I love. So next is The Pack by David Fisher. This book is about kind of the betrayal of man to his best friend. Lots of families bring pets to this one vacation island and then abandon them when it's time to leave. And so one family visiting this island ends up kind of experiencing the aftermath of doing that. So, yeah. Okay, first off, who in the hell gets a vacation dog and then abandons them on the island when the vacation is over? Like, what the hell? Is that really a thing? I don't know if that was just a plot thing for the book or if that's actually a thing. I really hope not. But to me, it's like, no wonder these animals have come back for revenge. Like, I'd be freaking pissed too. And to me, this was kind of just like a bunch of Cujos, a pack of Cujos. I mean, obviously not rabid, of course, but still just as vicious and angry. And lastly, I read The Willows by Algernon Blackwood. This is about two companions who set off for a canoe trip down the Danube River, only to kind of like lose their sanity on this trip. So the previous 3 books that I talked about fit more of the animal part of the subgenre. This book fit more of the nature parts. This was a pretty trippy read. You, as the reader, like, really start to get paranoid. Like, you can't really tell what's real and what's not. And I mean, that's exactly what the character is experiencing. And so it's kind of cool that, you know, because I've read a lot of books where the character goes insane and, like, you as the reader kind of go, dude, like, that's not really happening, you know? But this one, like, you're just really not sure, which is kind of a weird feeling to have. Like, you're experiencing it along with the character. This is a novella, so I think one of my biggest qualms is that I wish it was longer. Like, I know it's older, but the story, I think, really could have gone in a couple of different directions, but it kind of just, like, ends. Just, it's a little unsatisfying for how trippy it kind of all starts out to be, so. Yeah, so that's it for the books that I read. Let's talk about the movies that I watched. First is Little Joe. This is kind of following Alice, who is a new employee at this company. She's a plant breeder, and the company's kind of dedicated in developing this new flower species. And against policy, she decides to bring one home as a gift to her son. But soon, like, some things start happening and they kind of all start to question the actual nature of this plant. This was a very weird movie. At first it was kind of like, what in the hell did I just watch? And I wasn't sure if I really liked it, but then I kept thinking about it and I've actually watched it again, just to see if I could pick up on some details that I didn't before. So I would recommend this to people who like more of a kind of slow burn movie. It's more unsettling imagery, you know, lots of lights, facial expressions, stuff like that, rather than like really intense, gory scenes that I think people attribute to horror movies. And then, like I said, I would definitely consider this a horror movie. I think it's more of a psychological horror movie, which is interesting considering it really is based off of a plant. So, yeah. Next I watched The Last Winter. This is about a drilling crew in the Arctic. There is an environmental specialist that ends up coming there to stay with them, and he's trying to determine the impacts of drilling. And, you know, like any other crew trapped in the Arctic, like, things start to go awry. There's just something about isolation movies that I absolutely love. And I think what I loved more about this movie than some of the other isolation movies that I've seen, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking The Thing, which is absolutely fantastic. But this movie, like, the monster isn't obvious. You know, it's kind of almost like an afterthought. And it's more like nature reclaiming its home. And I think the movie definitely sparks conversations about global warming and, you know, what we might find as the ice is melting in these remote locations. So, yeah, it's kind of trippy. Next, I watched Animal. This is kind of about a group of friends that decide to go hiking, but soon discover they're being hunted by an animal. Um, so I will say that the animal in this movie is freaking terrifying. Um, and I think it's kind of the plot ends up going the way you would expect it to. But I will say there are a few twists in here which I was not expecting, which I think is why I enjoyed it more. Because it was kind of a different take. And, there it is an animal, but it's not really an animal you're familiar with. And I think there are some questions that don't really get answered, which make it even more trippy. Yeah. All right. Now, this last movie, I mean, we're talking about animal horror, so how could I not include Cujo? So I've actually read the book several times, but have never watched the movie. So I'm really glad I kind of finally had an excuse to watch it. And I will say, for an older movie, they did great with the special effects and making this freaking dog, like, just terrifying. The plot is pretty simple, and, like, most of the movie, you're with two people who are stuck in a car, but it just has enough intensity to, like, be engaged. And I think a lot of people who are scared of dogs is probably from this movie. Yeah. So that's it for the books and movies. Now let's talk through some of the recommendations that I have. We'll do books first. I have 4 of them. So, first is Cujo. I included the movie, so I feel like I have to include the book. Especially since if you've seen the movie but haven't read the book, please go read the book. It's amazing. And if you don't know what it's about, this is about Cujo, who is a Saint Bernard that gets bit by a rabid bat and basically goes on a killing rampage. And this to me is classic Stephen King. He's really good with this ability to take something that's normally so lovable. And there are a ton of people who are dog people. There are a ton of families who have dogs. So it's really familiar to everyone, but just he's got this knack of turning that into something really freaking horrifying. Yeah. Next is The Nest by Gregory Douglas. This is an older horror book that I first came across because it was republished by Valancourt Books as part of their Paperbacks from Hell series. But this is kind of about like an ordinary garbage dump on Cape Cod. And Poison Control decides to use a new spray out there. And it kind of results in these mutated cockroaches that are massive. And these cockroaches are out for blood. Cockroaches, I think, are just naturally kind of creepy. And I always thought they were kind of interesting until I read this book. This book actually made me really scared of them. There's lots of good attack scenes. I mean, it's pretty intense from the start to the end of the book. I think if you are a fan of Rats by James Herbert, this would be a great recommendation. Obviously more with insects instead of mammals, but I think that type of intensity and that type of, how do I want to say, like, that type of hunger that the animal experiences is very similar in both books. So, yeah. Next is Night Bitch by Rachel Yoder. This is about a mother who is a stay-at-home full-time mom with her 2-year-old son. And as the book progresses, we kind of see this struggle that she has with the pressures of motherhood, as well as, I'll say, a transformation into something resembling more of an animal. This was quite an interesting read. It was kind of like this weird combination of motherhood, being an animal, and going on this weird drug psychedelic trip. If that makes any sense. Now, when I read this, I think I originally gave it like 3 stars. Like, I thought it was just okay. But it's actually stuck with me. And I read this like early last year. So, you know, I think that says something in itself. And I would recommend it in this animal subgenre because I think it's very different and a kind of interesting take on the animal subgenre. So that's why I'm sticking it on here. And the last book I have is The Fungus by Harry Adam Knight. The last books that I've talked about have been obviously animal focused. This is more nature focused. Some mutated spores escape a lab and soon spread all across England. They end up causing many deaths, and people who have been exposed turn into something monstrous. And so the government puts together a group of scientists and military personnel to kind of discover, research, and attempt to stop this whole thing. So yes, this is fungi related, and I think it is perfect timing because I'm noticing that fungi is kind of making its rounds again in horror fiction, and I'm absolutely loving it. And this book does have a lot of really great body horror scenes, which if I'm going to read a book about fungi, like that's what I want. And I will say, if you liked, what was the name of that movie or that book? Annihilation. And especially the parts of that with that transformation. I think this would be a great recommendation for you. To me, this is for sure like a Nature Strikes Back kind of book. And, you know, just as you would think, like, how do you not get exposed? Like, this book takes an interesting turn on that, so. Now are the 4 movie recommendations I have. First is The Runes. This is about a group of friends who hike to a remote archaeological dig in the jungle, but aren't prepared for the evil that lurks beneath. Okay, so this is actually based on a book by the same name, which is written by Scott Smith. And I will admit that I watched the movie and have watched it several times. It's one of my favorites. But it took several watches of the movie before I even realized it was based on a book. And with that being said, I also do have to admit that I liked the movie better. Don't come for me. I think this is a great nature horror book. The monster is the plant itself. And it is freaking creepy. As far as the book, in comparison to the movie, I liked the characters a lot better. And I liked the series of events that took place in the movie a lot better. I think it really points to the horror of what they were experiencing. And again, that isolation trap feeling. Love it. Next is Jaws. I mean, like, I included the book, so I had to include the movie, you know. And again, I much prefer the movie over the book. The book had this weird, like, affair thing going on, which was completely unnecessary. And the movie totally skips over that, so I was very appreciative. And I think there's more shark content in the movie than in the book, but even with that, like I said previously with the book, I do wish there was even more shark content in the movie. You know, when I'm going to a movie about a shark attack, like, I want to see some shark attacks, you know? And I think this is probably a more well-known animal horror classic. Next I have Condo. This is kind of about a technology company. They sent a crew, and the first crew ends up kind of getting murdered. And so they send a second crew to kind of attempt to find out what happened to the first expedition. And this crew ends up kind of following and traveling with a professor who is looking to return his gorilla to the African Congo. Now, I will admit, the acting is a little sketchy, and there are some cringy spots, but I do love this movie. I think the myth of the killer ape is a classic myth, and I think it's one that I think a lot of people still believe today. And there have been, you know, like King Kong, obviously the myth of the killer giant ape, right? But I think this movie kind of played it a little bit different, and made it a little more, I want to say, realistic, which was great. And there were a lot of really action-packed and intense scenes, which I really liked. And yeah, I just thought it was a great movie. It is an older movie. I don't know if it's the 80s or the 90s, but yeah. It's one that I have on my list. I play it a lot just for background noise. So yeah, it's a great movie. I recommend it. And lastly, no hate on this one, but I'm including The Birds. This is about a wealthy socialite that kind of pursues like a potential boyfriend in this little California town that slowly takes a turn for the bizarre when all of the birds start attacking people. This is a pretty popular Hitchcock movie, and I think one of the first well-known animal attack horror movies. So, you know, you gotta include it. And don't get me wrong, like, I do a double take anytime I see a crowd of birds, because you just can't help it, you know? Well, that's everything I have for this video. Drop a comment below and let me know if you have any favorite animal and nature-y horror books and or movies. I would love to read more and even watch more movies around the subgenre. I really had a good time. And stay tuned for March, which will be the last subgenre in the monster section. And then we get to move on. Woohoo! Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.